Let's go!
Wanted to watch this Matt McMuscles video. He did a recent video that apparently a lot of people are really talking about the history of Street Fighter 3 and how it's a very weird history, how this game came to be, much less eventually turned into what is considered to be one of the greatest fighting games of all time, being the third version of that game. So, okay.
Welcome to another jump-punishing, projectile-parrying, and tornado DDTing episode of What Happened.
What are the viewership
show
on
that
this?
takes a look at video games.
Good for you,
Both
Matt.
great and less great, but
Fucking A,
all
good
with
for you.
troubled development cycles. I gotta get that out there to try and cut off the amount of, what, Street Fighter 3? That game's the sickest. Why would it be on your awful show? I totally get it. If you say Street Fighter 3 to anyone who's grown up with Capcom over the last 2 decades, they'll nod wistfully while humming beats, 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 beats in your head. This is because the CPS3 Stunner and its upgraded versions are looked back on as all-time classics.
We talk about this all the time. Street Fighter 3 New Generation, when it came out, people hated it. Nobody played it. It would talk about like arcade machines that nobody ever played. I swear, Street Fighter 3 New Generation was about as unplayed as Street Fighter the movie, the game. Not even kidding you. It was very different and it was very weird and it didn't look like Street Fighter. Like that was one of the big things, is that it didn't look like Street Fighter. It changed a little bit with Second Impact, and then Street Fighter 3 was where people eventually caught on and were like, damn, this game's great. Like Third Strike was definitely the changing moment.
Nowadays, which is a stark contrast to the mid and late 90s, where Street Fighter 3 was considered a huge financial bomb for Capcom and the
There's that
arcade
logo.
business in general. And not only that, it went through a long, protracted development that had numerous twists and turns. Remember, it was going to be a follow-up to the most popular fighting game of the age, and while you'd think there would have been a solid plan put into place to guide such an important project, this is Capcom, who has had a history of things sometimes going off the rails. So, it's for these reasons why Street Fighter 3 is now on our stage.
Zesty, thanks man
And
for the
with
prime.
that, I
Or the
think
tier
you'll
1.
all agree.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So tighten your headbands and rip off your muscle shirts. It's time to
Second
find out
Impact
what
is still a good
happened
game.
to
It's
Street
very
Fighter
fun.
3.
It just is, and like, there's something about like the feel of it, right? The way like hit impacts feel, the way dashing feels, the way like just overall the flow of the game is kind of off. But it's not bad. New Generation though feels off. Everything about that game when you play it now is like, ugh, whoa, the jumping feels weird, sweeping feels, everything feels weird.
If you were not alive from 1991 onwards, quick recap. Street Fighter 2 was the biggest thing in the world, as it essentially birthed the modern fighting game and reinvigorated the arcade industry with a model that placed emphasis on competitive play. Yeah, there were other combative arcade games before, but let's be real.
Yo, Violet
none
Cat,
of
thank
them
you.
were Street Fighter. Hey, yo, Buzz, Kato, and other guy, did you get out of here? This boom caused Capcom's arcade output to double and then triple, spurring them to split off their workforce into various teams who would all make fighting games all at the same time. There were the X-Men, and then the Marvel titles, Darkstalkers.
Oh, it was a
the
wonderful
expected
time to be
Street Fighter
alive.
2 updates, and finally the Alpha series. But there were also the 3D efforts like Star Gladiator, Tech Romancer, Power Stone, and Rival Schools. And then there was JoJo, Red Earth, Muscle Bomber, Cyberbots, and tons more I'm probably forgetting. Suffice to say, the arcade division was getting burned out, working on so much punching and kicking, and with each team spread out amongst so many franchises, an actual Street Fighter 3 wasn't even being considered. This is because much of the original Street Fighter 2 staff had moved over to the Alpha/Zero series, which they were very committed to continually polish and update. The story of Street Fighter 3 therefore spawns from a completely different
So there's the win screens. There's the win screens that we were just talking about, like the characters beat up in the end, how cool that is. This is how sick it is in Street Fighter 3. amazing. Presentation is godlike, dude. How sick is this? Like, holy shit.
Source. Tomoshi Sadamoto, who had done design work on Capcom's fantasy fare like Magic Sword, King of Dragons, and D&D, was given a small team to create a new, try to be surprised, fighting game in 1994.
Yikes.
Not only that, it was scheduled to use Capcom's in-development CPS-3
1994.
arcade hardware.
So 1994, this is when Super Turbo had already been out, so there's like 4 or 5 versions of Street Fighter 2. This is around the same time frame X-Men Children of the Atom had come out as well.
That was meant to push 2D animation to its absolute limit. Sadamoto was still quite keen on myths and legends and had originally planned for this project to take place in a more fantastical world. At the time, the game was known under its temp name of New Generation, simply because it was going to be a brand new IP. The problem, however, was that Sadamoto and his team didn't have any experience whatsoever making fighting games, and therefore struggled for almost a year with the design process, as well as trying to come to grips with a brand new advanced arcade board, and that wasn't even the half of it. Up until that point, Capcom had 1 to 2 producers who were overseeing the entirety of their in-development lineup, and would work on all of them at regular intervals. By the mid-90s though, games were being greenlit faster than they were being finished, so the Capcom bigwigs hired an outside consulting firm, who advised them that every project should have their own producer, which would help mitigate the workload. Now, while that seems completely reasonable, it meant that Sadamoto was promoted to producer, and was therefore the only one in charge of the game, which in turn was why it was floundering. So with New Generation without a main director/designer, it was going nowhere fast, and many outside staffers thought it wouldn't be long before it got KO'd off of Capcom's developmental slate. While the team got a much-needed boost in staff in 1995, it still wasn't enough for them to hone in on a concrete design and concept.
This doesn't come out until 97, by the way.
It was suggested that New Generation should turn into a street fight as a possible way to salvage it. Now, while this suggestion came from Akira Akiman Yasuda, the idea of it actually becoming Street Fighter 3 was still up in the air. If you've been paying attention for the last 3 years, you might recall Alan maintained that yes, in those early talks with Capcom, it was being thrown around that the game would be called Street Fighter 3. That's right, Capcom were actually debating putting that lofty number 3 shaped crown on a few potential projects, with New Generation finally winning out in the end.
Street Fighter the movie, the game was originally going to be Street Fighter 3. That's nuts.
That's great news, General. Congratulations.
On the contrary, I mourn.
Okay.
However, as we all know, heavy is the head that wears the crown. So for a game made by a new, inexperienced team to suddenly inherit such a prestigious sequel name meant the pressure was very much on. Fortunately, that's precisely when
here comes a new challenger!
An experienced staff member finally joined the team. In an interview with Matt Leone for his amazing
these articles are incredible.
Street Fighter and Oral History,
they're so
Capcom
cool.
Shinichiro Obata recalled, "By the time I came around, the team didn't really have a very clear concept of what to do with the game. They had created a lot of animation patterns, and they wanted the hits to feel like they had a real heft behind them, to make it look cool when you took damage. But the problem was the team had no idea what kind of mechanics should go into the game in order to make it an interesting fighting game. There was no plan for that, and there weren't enough moves for each character. So I ended up joining the team when the game was in that kind of state." Obata came from Darkstalkers.
Is this why Ken and Ryu weren't originally in Street Fighter 3? So from what I understand, this lines up with that story. I was told by ex-Capcom employees back in the day, and because a lot of people gave me shit about this, where like, no, Street Fighter 3 New Gen always had Ken and Ryu. I heard stories that the original arcade location tests for the game, which would happen several months, if not a long time before the actual release of the title, just to get people's feedback, they did not feature Ken and Ryu. They were not playable characters in those very early states of the game. And considering that it was not a Street Fighter game by confirmation, That starts to make a lot of sense.
and had a solid mind for fighting games, so he was an indispensable addition. However, the complexity of working
Alex
on
was the main
CPS3
character.
hardware was still slowing down development. But once things started to wrap up on Red Earth, Capcom's first CPS3 game, more people were able to join the new generation team and/or share their expertise.
This is a weird game.
Speaking of which, New Generation was kept as the subtitle, as it also referenced the fact that they were wiping the Street Fighter slate clean rather than cycling in the same core characters over and over and over again. This was similar to the approach that was used on the first alpha, allowing Capcom's creators to either drastically redesign old characters or
I was
make
looking for
completely
Akuma.
new ones.
Always gotta look for
Street Fighter 3
Akuma
was
in there.
going for much of the same thing, just going way harder, as even Ryu wasn't originally planned to be included at all. Lovable New Yorker meathead Alex was being positioned as the new main hero,
Well, there you
which
go.
explains why he's given so much prominence in the game's attract sequence.
We live back at Coney Island with this dickhead. Show some respect to this boot right here. There we go. There we go.
This dickhead.
Capcom second
This
guessed this
dickhead.
move, however, as they were worried about potential backlash over a lineup without a single familiar face, so the Eternal Warrior was added to the ranks. The team then second guessed that again deep into development, feeling that the roster was still on the paltry side, so welcome to the new generation, Mr. Masters! Also, they were able to just recycle a lot of Ryu's animation frames, so that's pretty much how Ken got in. Yes, animation. Street Fighter 3 was going to have more of it than any other 2D fighting game at the time, which, while an incredible artistic goal, was a costly one. Internally, within Capcom, there was worry that Street Fighter 3's ballooning price tag was becoming untenable, and with the way the industry was moving towards 3D, times were such that it was going to release to a marketplace that most likely
Damn,
had
it was
moved
emulated
on.
Tekken 3.
In an oral history, Capcom USA's Chris Kramer explained those concerns. At that point, the Street Fighter brand was kind of in a rocky place. You know, sales hadn't been good on the latest home versions. The US arcade market was dying, and everybody was looking at what was happening on PlayStation and Saturn.
Those are casino machines. What? Those aren't arcade machines?
Was dying, and everybody was looking
guess it
at
gets
what
the
was
idea
happening
behind.
on PlayStation and Saturn. They were like, okay, 3D games, this is the future. And Capcom was leaning in way hard on traditional 2D animation with Street Fighter 3. So it was like, okay, this looks great, but it looks like more Street Fighter. It was hard to say whether I thought it would be successful. I think my initial feedback was, it looks amazing. I was then told, oh, this will be CPS 3, so we'll have all new arcade hardware. They'll never be able to do this for the PlayStation.
It's funny. I had a very similar conversation with the lead producer of Street Fighter back when Street Fighter 5 came out. Like when he approached me looking for hopefully good news. Approached me like looking for my impressions of the game and like good news. And I told him it looks really good and really impressive and really smooth up close. But then I said, but when I was waiting at the back of the line and I was looking at the game, if you just walked by this and you looked at Street Fighter 5, it looks a lot like Street Fighter 4. Visually, very similar to SF4 from 10 feet away. Obviously, you get close and you look at shit. Oh, that's clearly a different game. Clearly. But you have to assume that the greater majority of people that are investing into a new fighting game want that shit to look substantially different. They want it to look and play different than the previous games. All things considered, considering like the launch of Street Fighter 5 and essentially where the game failed the most, dude, I think visually the game just looks like a slightly upgraded SF4 in some ways, you know? But yes, your game needs to look different, like and be more appealing from a bit of distance.
Won't be
Way
able
less
to
stages
do all
and
the
shit.
animation correctly.
Took a
The
long
arcade
time for
guys
5 to get on
always
people's
wanted to
good
make
side.
the ultimate arcade experience, even though realistically the line was like, Hey, put it out in the arcades. It gets popular, and then 6-8 months later, it comes home, and then the sales explode from there. He ain't lying. Street Fighter II sold over 6 million copies on just the Super Nintendo version alone, and that was a potential problem with Street Fighter III's long-term profitability. No home console at that time.
Yeah, I want a
would have been
drastically
able to
different art
handle
direction.
it.
That's what I want.
Hell, the PlayStation struggled to run certain CPS2 games with all the animation intact, so what chance did Elena's idle animation have? With 6 months left to go in the game's development, the team got some much-needed additions in terms of staff, including Alpha 2 alum designer Hidetoshi Neo-G Ishizawa,
There you go.
who helped refine and polish Street Fighter III's parry system. Super Arts and Super Canceling were also last-minute additions that the team worked hard to include, and while that might seem strange due to super attacks having been around since Super Turbo, it was another example of the team's slow,
Team just had no
kinda
experience.
unconfident design phase. The thing is, there was so much pressure from within the company and from other teams because this was Street Fighter III, right? You know, this was the sequel or what came after the legendary Street Fighter II, so there was just no way this game would be allowed to fail, and the team themselves, they were feeling that pressure, but they also felt the sense of obligation to complete what they were trying to do. There was a lot of indecisiveness, there was a lot of back and forth discussion on what to do, and eventually they figured it out. Yeah, maybe we should do this, this, and that, so it took a lot of time for the team to gather its bearings. Unfortunately, despite that passion, when Street Fighter III or just 3 machines started arriving in arcades across the world, apathy was at an all-time high. It hit the scene right in the middle of the releases of 2 lavish 3D blockbusters that were also on their 3rd iterations,
Tekken.
namely Virtua Fighter and Tekken, which were attracting crowds no matter what side of the globe you were on. What's worse is that the fighting game limelight not only had to be shared with these cutting-edge 3D slugfests, but also with other competition like Marvel Super Heroes vs. Street Fighter, Darkstalkers 3, and everything from SNK. New generations stuck out, but not exactly in a good way. Players would put in a quarter and see Ken and Ryu flanked by a bunch of newcomers.
Bunch of fucking weirdos. Ken and Ryu fighting a bunch of fucking weirdos, to be frank.
As they were not so affectionately called. The game, due to its origins and how the new team had made it, also felt very different when compared to the likes of the Street Fighter II or Alpha series. It was slower and more strategic, whereas almost every other Capcom game in the arcades revolved around insane combos, team-up attacks.
This whole fucking methodology of like, we're gonna slow down our game and make it slower and more strategic never works out in the long run. Shit never ends up being like, oh, I'm so glad we did that. Like, no, you're always going to eventually change all that shit, make it faster, make it snappier. It's always gonna happen.
And other flashy shit. To casual players, it seemed like every other game was all about offering more moves and bigger rosters, whereas Street Fighter III seemed like a step back. Less characters, less options for your supers, less dimensions, and less familiarity. It was basically going against all the arcade trends of the day. So it's because of this that in terms of cabinets sold, New Generation was an unmitigated disaster.
Nobody bought it.
And I know I throw that term around a lot on this show, but it really actually was. The initial version of Street Fighter III saw shockingly low sales. I remember seeing the numbers and just being really surprised at how the game just wasn't selling. It felt like we created the worst selling game ever at Capcom. It felt awful. The first run of orders for Street Fighter III reportedly hovered at around 1,000 machines. To put that into perspective, the original Final Fight had sold 30,000.
I played one of them.
SF2 Turbo 75. In an oral history, several former Capcom employees debated this number, but the general consensus is that it sold incredibly poorly. So that, coupled with the high price tag of the CPS3 board and Street Fighter III's overall development costs, which were just over 1 billion yen or $8 million, still very high for a 90s fighting game, that New Generation failed to ever turn a profit. Of course, a good chunk of this had to do with the sudden downfall of the arcade business in general, because as a principal revenue source, it was quickly being replaced with home consoles. Why drive or take a bus to the arcade to play Tekken 3 that doesn't even have GON when you can stay at home and experience an even better version that does have GON? Speaking of arcade ports, there is another reason why New Generation was
Soul
such
Calibur
a huge
issue.
blow to Capcom financially. It took almost 4 years for a home port to be released.
Yeah, the home port would eventually show up on Dreamcast in like 1999-2000, and it was the double impact. It had Street Fighter 3 New Gen as well as Second Impact on one disc. So Third Strike was sold as a separate, different game.
Street Fighter 3 Double Impact
Well, there we go. I'll
was
shut
a
the fuck up,
Dreamcast
Matt.
exclusive that launched in Japan at the end of 1999 and mid-2000 in the rest of the world. While it had plenty of value as it packed in 2 games, by that time the Dreamcast was already fading in much of the world, and Double Impact was made further redundant when a port of Third Strike came out that following October. Ah, yes, the revisions. Second Impact Giant Attack was released just a few months after New Generation in the arcades, and it added 2 new characters, Hugo and Urien, and threw Akuma in there as a bonus.
Dude, the crazy thing about Capcom arcade games in the 90s was that when there was like a new fighting game, if not an update to a fighting game, like for example, Street Fighter 3 to Street Fighter 3 Second Impact, or X-Men versus Street Fighter to Marvel Superheroes versus Street Fighter, guess how much time there was in between those releases? Guess how many months it was for like the new version of the game to show up and replace the old version. 6 months, chat. You would think a year is being generous. It was like 6 months. Fucking crazy. They were pumping shit out.
While seen as a marked improvement, it didn't really move the needle much in terms of getting people to actually play it. Neo G, for his part, was seen as a standout member of the team, and was then given further control leading into the release of the next and last revision, Third Strike Fight for the Future. Despite all the system-wide improvements and additions, Third Strike was still criticized for its bizarre new challengers like 12 and Q, and while many applauded the return of Chun-Li and her body yada yada, Alpha 3 cabinets would still see the lion's share of Capcom fans' quarters. Obata estimated that when you combined all 3 versions as well as the home ports, Street Fighter 3 eventually dragged itself over the line of profitability by the end, which is still kinda not what Capcom bigwigs wanted to hear.
You want to make money.
Remember,
you don't want to break even, you want to make money.
The direct sequel to their biggest arcade hit of the 90s. Every iteration of Street Fighter 2 had been leading up to this. So when it wasn't a success, changes were therefore coming to Capsule Computer's business strategy, and Street Fighter 3's failure was a big part as to why. Former Capcom USA CEO Bill Gardner had this to say about the massive decline for the arcade division. When Street Fighter 3 came out, the home console business was starting to really take off. I mean, really take off. And so when we made our monthly reports in Japan, we go over and I'm reporting on a multi-million seller on home console, right? And CoinOp was saying, well, we sold 450 units this month or something like that, you know? And Capcom Japan CEO Kenzo Sugimoto was
This guy is still the CEO of the company.
he was beside himself. He was convinced they weren't working.
Dude is like
and
ancient now, and he's
quite in
still
touch
doing it.
with the revolution that was taking place. So it wasn't long before those sweeping changes swept across Capcom. Arcade teams were moved onto consoles and were told to either sink or swim. If you'd like to see an example of them very much sinking, check out my Devil May Cry 2 episode. As the new millennium dawned, Capcom made less and less fighters until they were almost completely phased out by 2001. But in the years
CVS2 was the last
following
one.
that, the general opinion on
Last
Street
real
Fighter
one.
3 Third Strike specifically slowly began to change. This was helped greatly by Japanese players showing off what the game could offer and just how hype it could be. It was different, yes, and if you wanted someone that played exactly like Rose, Blanca, or Honda, you're kinda shit out of luck. But if you looked past the freaks and acclimatized to the systems and game speed, you found a very deep, very fighting-rich experience thanks to all the tweaks and improvements that the team tried to squeeze in. Of course, we can't forget the huge part that the early editions of EVO played in this movement, especially certain milestone moments in fighting game history.
Oh hey, that's me!
So throughout the 2000s, Third Strike began to accrue this reputation as an underrated masterpiece that was not fully appreciated in its day, as it originally came out during a time where the industry was starting to shy away from fighting games. Now, bearing the Dreamcast version, the game never got a port on anything outside of Japan until 2005 with the Street Fighter Anniversary Collection, and later in 2011, Iron Galaxy's sublime Third Strike Online should be re-released. This is not the first nor the last time I will ask about this, Capcom! Nowadays, Third Strike is often seen by many as the pinnacle of the Street Fighter franchise, from its tactile, meaty feel to its graphics and animation, down to every minutia of its gameplay. But goddamn, did it take a long time to get there. It's really amazing that it started out.
It's funny, the same thing can be said about Street Fighter V. Really. Took a long time to get there, but they got there. That's a very good game. It's a very fun game too, you know?
As a completely separate franchise that was never intended to be the next evolution of street fighting, and it's mind-boggling to think about all the paths not taken. Capcom could have just kept running the Alpha series into the ground until it petered out. They could have had their own 3D teams make a big lavish sequel, and finally, my favorite, the exploding life bars and slam mastering of SF the movie could have been Street Fighter 3. Just speaking for myself though, in a way I'm glad that Street Fighter 3 had to persevere and fight for the respect that it eventually earned. We'll leave on Obata's words regarding what the team were striving for. You know, there are many different approaches you can take to game design. One approach, which we took in Street Fighter 3, is to design your game around unanswerables. I think with any game, players will search for the best tactic, the best strategy, like if X happens, then you should always do Y. If you do this here, you'll always win. There's competitive games like that, where the match is essentially a confrontation of theoretical knowledge that each player has built up. But Street Fighter 3 is a game that, by design, doesn't have a fixed answer to those questions. There is no best tactic. You can spend your whole life trying to find the perfect theoretical approach to a situation in SF3, but it will never be quite right. You always have to be reading your opponent in the moment. You can't just fall back on your theories. It's a game that lets you search for answers forever. Man, that's some deep-ass shit. If you know of any other fighting games that were fraught with failure, let me know in the comments.
I'm back for the people. That's actually a really good quote. In fact, it's funny that is, and it's kind of true. What he is describing in that quote is quite literally emergent gameplay, you know? And it's one of the things that makes Killer Instinct a great fucking game. It's one of the things that makes a lot of the best classic fighting games like Melee and stuff like that extremely renowned and beloved. By the way, another big shout out to Matt for putting these together. For you guys that don't know, his channel is full of these What Happened videos, as well as a variety of other stuff that go over the huge, crazy history of the video game industry, and I've worked with him on a few of them, including Marvel vs. Capcom and Killer Instinct. So, by all means, click the link in the description below to check out more of his videos. And another big thanks to him for allowing us to watch this on this channel and check this out, as it covers a whole bunch of topics that have been talked about for so many years, and we finally got some resolution on.